Behind Sidney Poitier's beloved 1974 comedy Uptown Saturday Night lies a treasure trove of bizarre secrets. From Harry Belafonte stuffing cotton in his cheeks to impersonate Marlon Brando, to a famous baseball legend mysteriously vanishing from the final cut, to Richard Pryor stealing scenes in a role originally meant for him as the lead. Even weirder? The climactic chase features impossible mountain roads in flat Chicago, and one dance legend played a tiny gangster most audiences never recognized. Fact 1. Cotton. Stuffed cheeks Godfather parody. When Harry Belafonte stepped onto the set of Uptown Saturday Night in 1973, he had a very specific vision for his character Geechee Dan Beauford that involved a trip to the bathroom medicine cabinet. The legendary singer and actor literally stuffed cotton balls into his cheeks to create puffy jowls, then practiced speaking in a deliberately raspy, whispery voice until he had perfected his impression of Marlon Brando's iconic Don Vito Corleone from The Godfather, which had been released just 2 years earlier in 1972. Belafonte's transformation was so complete that audiences could barely recognize the handsome calypso star beneath the gangster makeup, and his performance became one of the film's most memorable elements. He didn't just copy Brando's physical appearance, though, he also mimicked the Don's mannerisms, including the way Corleone would stroke his chin thoughtfully and speak in measured, threatening tones. The cotton-stuffed cheeks gave Belafonte's face the same heavy, jowly appearance that made Brando's Godfather so menacing. But in Belafonte's hands, the imitation became brilliantly comedic rather than scary. What made the parody even more hilarious was that Belafonte played Geechee Dan as anything but a strong, intimidating character. While Don Corleone commanded respect and fear, Geechee Dan was portrayed as a somewhat bumbling, ineffective gangster who tried to project authority but often fell short. The contrast between the serious, cotton-enhanced appearance and the character's actual incompetence created a perfect comedic tension that had audiences laughing throughout his scenes. According to reports from the time, Marlon Brando himself eventually saw Belafonte's performance and reportedly laughed out loud at the clever tribute to his most famous role, showing that even the original Don Corleone could appreciate a good parody of his work. Fact 2. Baseball star's vanishing act. In October of 1973, Hollywood Reporter announced something that would have been a major crossover moment between sports and entertainment. Baseball legend Hank Aaron had been officially signed by producer, director, and star Sidney Poitier for a role in Uptown Saturday Night. This was particularly exciting news because Aaron was at the peak of his fame, just months away from breaking Babe Ruth's all-time home run record in April of 1974, making him one of the most recognizable athletes in America at the time. The signing seemed like a natural fit since Sidney Poitier had already proven he could successfully blend entertainment with social significance, and having Aaron appear in the film would have added another layer of cultural importance to the project. Aaron was not just any baseball player, he was a civil rights icon who had faced tremendous racism and death threats while pursuing Ruth's record, making his potential appearance in a positive, uplifting black comedy particularly meaningful. However, when Uptown Saturday Night was released in June of 1974, audiences who had been expecting to see the home run king were left puzzled, because Aaron was nowhere to be found in the final cut of the movie. No official explanation was ever given for why Aaron's role was removed or what his character was supposed to be in the story. The production notes and interviews from the time period don't provide any details about what happened between the October announcement and the film's completion in early 1974. What makes this mystery even more intriguing is that the film already featured several other notable cameos and celebrity appearances, so it wasn't as if Poitier was trying to keep the cast small or avoid having famous faces in smaller roles. The absence of any behind-the-scenes stories or explanations about Aaron's disappearance from the project remains one of the film's most puzzling production mysteries. Fact 3. Pryor's reduced role revenge. The buddy comedy roles of Steve Jackson and Wardell Franklin that made Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby such a memorable duo were never supposed to be theirs in the first place, because screenwriter Richard Wesley originally wrote those lead parts specifically for two of the most groundbreaking comedians of the era, Richard Pryor and Red Fox. This casting choice would have made perfect sense since both comedians were known for their raw, honest humor and had already proven they could handle dramatic roles alongside their comedy work, with Pryor appearing in films like Lady Sings the Blues, and Fox building his reputation through his legendary party records and nightclub performances. However, when the project reached the studio executives, they made a decision that would completely change the film's trajectory by declaring that Pryor and Fox were not big box office draws and therefore too risky to carry a major motion picture. This was particularly short-sighted considering that Pryor was already gaining recognition for his stand-up comedy and film appearances, while Fox was at the height of his fame thanks to the massive success of Sanford & Son, which was pulling in 20 million viewers each week on television. Instead of landing the starring role he was meant to have, Richard Pryor was relegated to a small cameo appearance as Sharp Eye Washington, a supposedly skilled private detective who turns out to be anything but competent. Despite having only one scene in the entire movie, Pryor managed to make such a strong impression that many viewers and critics noted his brief appearance as one of the film's highlights. His natural comedic timing and ability to create a fully realized character in just a few minutes of screen time demonstrated exactly why he should have been given a much larger role in the first place, making the studio's original decision look even more questionable in hindsight. Fact 4. Dancing Legend's secret cameo. Hidden in plain sight among the gangsters and comic characters of Uptown Saturday Night, was one of the most accomplished performers in entertainment history, though most moviegoers watching in 1974 had absolutely no idea they were looking at a dance legend. Harold Nicholas, who played the small but memorable role of Little Seymour, was actually one half of the Nicholas brothers, a tap-dancing duo that many professional dancers and choreographers still consider to be among the greatest performers who ever lived. The Nicholas brothers had been dazzling audiences since the 1930s with their incredible acrobatic tap dancing, performing splits, flips, and leaps that seemed to defy gravity while maintaining perfect rhythm and style. Harold and his brother Fayard had appeared in major Hollywood musicals like Stormy Weather and Sun Valley Serenade, where their legendary staircase dance sequence is still studied by dancers today as one of the most athletic and graceful performances ever captured on film. By the time Harold Nicholas appeared in Uptown Saturday Night, he was in his early 50s and had spent decades as one of the most celebrated entertainers in the world, having performed for presidents, royalty, and audiences across the globe. However, his role as Little Seymour required none of his dancing abilities and instead cast him as a tough, diminutive gangster who appeared alongside his much larger bodyguard Big Percy, creating a classic big guy, little guy comedy pairing. What makes this casting even more remarkable is that Nicholas played the role completely straight, with no hint of his background as a dancer or entertainer. He delivered his lines as a serious criminal character, and audiences who weren't familiar with his legendary career would have simply seen him as another actor playing a small gangster role, never suspecting they were watching one of the most gifted physical performers of the 20th century. Fact 5. Chicago's Impossible Mountains. The climactic chase sequence in Uptown Saturday Night features Steve Jackson and Wardell Franklin racing through dramatic, winding mountain roads with steep drops and rocky canyon views that create an exciting action finale, except for one glaring problem that anyone familiar with Chicago geography would immediately notice. The film is clearly set in Chicago throughout the entire story, with characters mentioning the city by name and Steve Jackson working at a Chicago steel mill. Yet the final car chase suddenly transports viewers to what appears to be mountainous terrain that looks more like Southern California than anywhere in the Midwest. Chicago sits in one of the flattest regions of the United States, located on the shores of Lake Michigan, in an area that was once covered by glaciers, which left behind terrain so level that the city's highest natural point is only about 672 feet above sea level. The entire Chicago metropolitan area is characterized by prairie land, small rolling hills at most, and certainly nothing that resembles the steep, winding mountain roads with dramatic cliffside drops that appear in the movie's chase scene. What makes this geographical impossibility even more noticeable is that the production notes indicate the film was shot at multiple studios including MGM and Paramount, along with various Los Angeles locations, which explains where the mountainous terrain actually came from. The filmmakers apparently decided that an exciting car chase was more important than geographical accuracy, so they used whatever dramatic landscape was available near their California filming locations, rather than trying to create a chase scene that would make sense for Chicago's flat terrain. The mistake is so obvious that it creates an unintentionally funny moment for viewers who know the area. As they watch characters who have been in flat, urban Chicago suddenly find themselves careening around mountain curves that would require them to have traveled several hundred miles to reach such terrain. Fact 6. Character name credit confusion. When audiences watched Uptown Saturday Night in theaters, they witnessed a peculiar inconsistency that somehow slipped past the editors and producers during the final stages of production, creating a mystery that has never been officially explained. At the beginning of the film, the opening credits proudly announce Harry Belafonte's memorable gangster character, with the special billing and Harry Belafonte as Geechee Dan, giving the impression that this single name represents the complete identity of his cotton-cheeked villain who parodies Marlon Brando's Godfather performance. However, when the movie ends and the closing credits roll, viewers who pay attention to the final cast listings will notice that the exact same character is suddenly identified as Geechee Dan Buford, with the addition of a last name that was never mentioned anywhere in the opening credits or spoken aloud during any of the characters' scenes throughout the entire movie. This creates a confusing situation where the same person appears to have two different names depending on whether you're looking at the beginning or end of the film. The discrepancy becomes even more puzzling when you consider that this wasn't a small, overlooked character who might have been easy to miss during the editing process, but rather one of the film's most prominent supporting roles played by a major star who received special billing in the opening credits. The fact that Harry Belafonte was specifically highlighted with an "and" credit suggests that his character's name would have been carefully reviewed and approved by multiple people during production. No official explanation has ever been provided for why the character's name appears differently in the two credit sequences, and production notes from the time don't shed any light on whether this was an intentional creative decision, a clerical error, or perhaps the result of script changes that weren't properly coordinated between the opening and closing credit sequences. Fact 7. Flip Wilson's acting debut. When Flip Wilson stepped in front of the movie cameras for Uptown Saturday Night, he was making entertainment history in a way that most audiences probably didn't realize at the time, because this comedy marked the very first film performance of his entire career. Wilson was already one of the biggest names in television comedy by 1974, having built his reputation through The Flip Wilson Show, which had made him a household name, and one of the most successful variety show hosts on television during the early 1970s. Wilson's television success was built on his incredible ability to create memorable characters, most famously Geraldine Jones with her catchphrase, "What you see is what you get," along with his natural timing and infectious personality that made him a favorite guest on talk shows and comedy specials. However, despite his massive popularity on the small screen, Wilson had never made the transition to movies, making his role as the Reverend in Sidney Poitier's comedy his official big-screen debut. His character in Uptown Saturday Night allowed Wilson to showcase a different side of his comedic talents, playing a more subdued role than the flamboyant characters that had made him famous on television. As the Reverend, Wilson brought his natural charm and humor to the role while demonstrating that he could adapt his performance style from the broad, theatrical approach that worked well for variety television to the more naturalistic acting required for film comedy. The casting of Wilson alongside other established entertainers like Sidney Poitier, Bill Cosby, Harry Belafonte, and Richard Pryor created an impressive lineup of talent that represented different areas of the entertainment world, with Wilson bringing his television variety show expertise to complement the others' film and stage experience, making his movie debut particularly significant as part of this ensemble cast. Fact 8. Marlon Brando's laughing approval. One of the most delightful behind-the-scenes stories from Uptown Saturday Night involves the reaction of the very actor who inspired Harry Belafonte's memorable gangster performance, and it shows that even Hollywood's most serious dramatic actors can appreciate a good joke at their own expense. According to reports from the time, Marlon Brando himself eventually got the chance to see Harry Belafonte's cotton-cheeked parody of his iconic Don Vito Corleone character from The Godfather, and his response was exactly what comedy fans would hope for from such a legendary performer. Rather than being offended or annoyed by someone making fun of one of his most acclaimed roles, Brando reportedly laughed out loud when he watched Belafonte's exaggerated imitation of his Godfather performance, complete with the stuffed cheeks, raspy whisper, and deliberate mannerisms that had made Don Corleone such a memorable character. This reaction is particularly meaningful because Brando was known for being very protective of his work and taking his craft extremely seriously, so his positive response to the parody suggests that he genuinely appreciated the skill and humor that Belafonte brought to the tribute. The fact that Brando found the imitation funny rather than insulting also speaks to the quality of Belafonte's performance, since a poorly done or mean-spirited parody might have generated a very different reaction from the original actor. Instead, Brando's laughter indicated that he recognized the affectionate nature of the tribute and could see the comedic talent required to transform his menacing gangster character into something hilarious, while still maintaining the recognizable elements that made the parody work. This positive response from the original Don Corleone himself became part of the film's legacy, adding an extra layer of validation to what was already considered one of the movie's funniest performances. Fact 9. Failed TV pilot mystery. Shortly after Uptown Saturday Night proved to be a box office success, NBC television executives decided they wanted to capture some of that movie magic for the small screen by commissioning a sitcom version of the popular film, but their adaptation attempt would become one of television's forgotten curiosities. The network hired two talented actors to take over the roles that Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby had made famous. Cleavon Little, who was best known for his starring role in Mel Brooks' comedy Blazing Saddles, was cast as Wardell Washington, while singer and actor Adam Wade took on the character that had been played by Poitier in the original film. The television pilot attempted to recreate the buddy comedy chemistry that had worked so well in the movie, but it faced the challenging task of translating a story that was built around a specific adventure involving a stolen lottery ticket into an ongoing series format that would need to generate new storylines week after week. The pilot was completed and presented to NBC executives for consideration as a potential addition to their regular programming lineup, but despite the success of the original film and the talent of the two lead actors, the network ultimately decided not to move forward with the series. Rather than simply disappearing into the television archives forever, the failed pilot got an unusual second life when NBC aired it during the summer of 1979 as part of a special showcase called Comedy Theater, which was specifically designed to give viewers a chance to see pilots that had been produced but never picked up for series development. This gave television audiences a rare opportunity to see what might have been if the Uptown Saturday Night sitcom had actually made it to air, though the single broadcast meant that most people who saw it probably had no idea they were watching a piece of television history. Fact 10. Studio musical chairs. The production of Uptown Saturday Night became a complicated juggling act that involved multiple major Hollywood studios and distributors, creating one of the most logistically complex filming arrangements of the early 1970s. When the project first began development in 1973, Variety reported that National General Pictures was set to handle the distribution of Sidney Poitier's comedy, but by the time the film actually reached theaters in June of 1974, Warner Brothers had taken over all distribution responsibilities without any public explanation for why the original arrangement fell through. The filming locations were just as scattered as the distribution deal, with production moving between some of Hollywood's most famous studio lots in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated dance between different facilities. The main filming took place at MGM Studios, which provided the primary sound stages and production facilities needed for the interior scenes and controlled set pieces that made up much of the movie's action. However, additional filming was also conducted at Paramount Studios, requiring the cast and crew to pack up their equipment and move to an entirely different studio lot to complete certain scenes that apparently couldn't be accommodated at MGM. On top of these two major studio locations, the production also ventured out to various Los Angeles area locations for exterior shots and scenes that required real-world backgrounds rather than constructed sets. This multi-studio approach was relatively unusual for the time period, when most films were typically shot at a single studio facility to maintain consistency and control costs, but the arrangement somehow worked well enough to keep the production on schedule and within budget. The pre-production work had also included some initial filming in Chicago to establish the authentic setting and provide establishing shots that would ground the story in its Midwestern location before the main production moved to California. Fact 11. Multiple production company chaos. The official copyright statement for Uptown Saturday Night reveals an unusually complicated business arrangement that involved not just one or two companies, but three separate production entities, all sharing ownership rights to the film in what appears to be one of the most complex studio deals of the 1970s. The complete copyright claimant statement officially lists Verdun Productions Limited, the First Artists Production Company Limited, and Warner Brothers Incorporated as the three companies that held legal ownership of the finished movie, creating a situation where no single studio could claim complete control over the project. This three-way ownership structure was highly unusual for Hollywood productions of that era, when most films were typically owned outright by a single major studio or involved at most a partnership between two companies. The arrangement suggests that each company brought different resources or expertise to the production, with Verdun Productions likely being Sidney Poitier's own production company that gave him creative control over the project as director and star. The first artist production company was particularly significant because it was a unique venture formed by several major stars, including Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Barbra Streisand, and Steve McQueen, who had banded together to create their own production company that would give them more creative freedom and financial control over their projects than traditional studio contracts typically allowed. This company represented a revolutionary approach to filmmaking that put more power in the hands of the actual performers rather than studio executives. Warner Brothers' involvement brought the major studio resources and distribution network that were essential for getting the film into theaters nationwide, but their participation as one of three equal partners, rather than the sole owner, created an unusually balanced power structure that protected the creative team's interests while still providing the financial backing and marketing muscle needed for commercial success. Fact 12. Box office miracle numbers. The financial success of Uptown Saturday Night exceeded everyone's expectations in a way that demonstrated just how hungry audiences were for positive, entertaining films featuring black performers during the mid-1970s. The movie was produced on a relatively modest budget of $2.5 million, which was considered reasonable for a comedy at the time, but certainly wasn't the kind of massive investment that studios typically put behind their biggest blockbuster hopefuls. However, when the film opened in theaters in June of 1974, audiences responded with such enthusiasm that the box office numbers quickly climbed to $7.4 million in domestic earnings, which represented nearly 3 times the original production cost, and turned the project into a genuine financial success story. This impressive return on investment proved that there was a significant market for well-made comedies that showcased talented black performers in positive, non-stereotypical roles, something that Hollywood had often been reluctant to acknowledge. Even more remarkable was the speed at which the film achieved its success, because just 3 months after its initial release, Uptown Saturday Night had climbed all the way to the number 3 position on the list of the top 50 highest-grossing films of the year. This rapid ascent up the box office charts was particularly impressive considering that the film was competing against major studio releases with much larger marketing budgets and wider initial distribution patterns. The commercial success of Uptown Saturday Night was significant enough to convince Warner Brothers that there was real money to be made in this type of entertainment, leading directly to the production of 2 sequels, Let's Do It Again in 1975 and A Piece of the Action in 1977, both of which reunited Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby in similar buddy comedy adventures. Fact 13. National Film Registry recognition. 50 years after audiences first laughed at Harry Belafonte's cotton-stuffed cheeks and Bill Cosby's scheming plans, Uptown Saturday Night received one of the highest honors that can be bestowed upon an American film when the Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2024. This prestigious recognition places Sidney Poitier's comedy alongside some of the most important movies in cinema history, including classics like Citizen Kane, Casablanca, and The Wizard of Oz, as films that are deemed worthy of permanent preservation for future generations. The National Film Registry was established by Congress in 1988 as a way to ensure that culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant American films would be preserved in their original form before deterioration, loss, or technological obsolescence could destroy them forever. Each year, the Library of Congress selects up to 25 films for inclusion based on recommendations from the public, film scholars, and preservation experts, making it an extremely selective honor that represents the most important American cinema. The specific citation for Uptown Saturday Night recognized the film as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, which acknowledges its importance not just as entertainment, but as a document of its time period and a significant contribution to American film culture. This recognition is particularly meaningful because it validates the film's role in providing positive representation of black characters and performers during an era when Hollywood was still struggling with stereotypical portrayals. The timing of this recognition, coming exactly 50 years after the film's original release, creates a perfect symmetry that highlights how a movie that was initially seen primarily as light entertainment has gained respect over the decades as an important piece of American cultural history that deserves to be preserved and studied by future film scholars and audiences. Fact 14. Failed remake development hell. In 2002, Will Smith and his production company Overbrook Entertainment purchased the remake rights to the entire Uptown Saturday Night trilogy, with ambitious plans to bring Sidney Poitier's beloved comedy into the 21st century. But what seemed like a straightforward project has since become one of Hollywood's most prolonged examples of development hell. Smith's original vision was to recreate the buddy comedy magic with himself in one of the lead roles alongside other major African-American stars, specifically hoping to recruit Eddie Murphy and Martin Lawrence to complete a modern version of the trio that would capture the same spirit and chemistry that made the original film so successful. The project seemed promising from the start, with Warner Brothers agreeing to distribute the remake and multiple screenwriters being hired to update the 1970s story for contemporary audiences. However, as the years passed, the remake encountered one obstacle after another, including numerous script rewrites that never quite satisfied the producers, and a revolving door of directors who were attached to the project only to leave for various reasons before filming could begin. By 2012, the project had undergone significant changes, with Adam McKay being brought in to direct a new version of the script written by Tim Dowling, and the casting focus shifting to pair Smith with Denzel Washington instead of the original comedy stars that had been considered. Even this new approach failed to move the project forward, and by 2018, the remake had gone through yet another transformation, with Kevin Hart being attached to star and Malcolm D. Lee being brought in as the new director. Despite more than 20 years of development and multiple attempts to get the cameras rolling, the Uptown Saturday Night remake remains stuck in pre-production, making it one of the longest-running development projects in modern Hollywood history. Fact 15. Associate Producer, Editor Combo. Among the unusual aspects of Uptown Saturday Night's production was the distinctive credit given to Pembroke J. Herring, whose on-screen billing read Associate Producer and Film Editor, representing a combination of roles that was extremely rare in Hollywood filmmaking during the 1970s. This dual credit meant that Herring was simultaneously involved in both the business and creative sides of the production, giving him responsibilities that typically would have been handled by two completely different people with entirely separate skill sets and areas of expertise. As an associate producer, Herring would have been involved in the logistical and financial aspects of making the movie, working closely with Sidney Poitier and the other producers to coordinate schedules, manage budgets, oversee daily production needs, and handle the countless business decisions that arise during filming. This role required strong organizational skills, business acumen, and the ability to solve practical problems that could affect the production's timeline or costs. At the same time, his role as film editor made him responsible for one of the most creative and technically demanding aspects of post-production, requiring him to work with thousands of feet of film footage to assemble the final version of the movie. Film editors in the 1970s worked with actual strips of celluloid film, cutting and splicing pieces together by hand while making crucial decisions about pacing, rhythm, and storytelling that could make or break the finished product. The combination of these two roles in a single person was highly unusual because they required completely different types of expertise and typically demanded full-time attention during different phases of production. Herring's ability to successfully handle both responsibilities suggests he possessed an exceptional range of skills that allowed him to serve as both a business partner in the production process and the creative professional who shaped the final version that audiences saw in theaters.